Did you ever realize that the Bible uses 3 different names to refer apparently to the same people? And it never clearly explains the difference. Throughout the scriptures appear the terms Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews. Many people read them as if they were synonyms, as if they all meant exactly the same thing. But in reality, it is not so. Each of those names was born at a specific moment in biblical history and reveals a distinct stage in the development of the people of God. When you understand this difference, your way of reading the Bible changes completely. In this video, you are going to discover something very simple, but deeply revealing. First, you will understand why Abraham was called a Hebrew. Later, we will see at what moment the Hebrews began to be known as Israelites. And finally, you will discover how the term Jews appeared. Each name represents a different stage, a distinct identity, and a key moment within the plan of God. And when you finish this journey, you will begin to notice details in the scriptures that previously went unnoticed. But before entering into the history, take a second to subscribe to the channel and activate the little bell so as not to miss content that makes the Bible clearer and easier to understand. And if this topic seems interesting to you, also leave your like so that more people can discover these fundamental differences. Now yes, let us go to the beginning of everything. The first time that the Bible uses the word Hebrew appears in Genesis 14, verse 13. The text says, "Then one who had escaped came and told it to Abram, the Hebrew." That simple phrase presents us with a very interesting question. Why was Abraham called a Hebrew? Where does that name come from? The Hebrew word used in the text is Ibri. Its literal meaning can be translated as the one who crossed, the one who came from the other side, or the one who traversed. And when we look at the history of Abraham, that definition begins to have a lot of sense. Abraham originally lived in Ur of the Chaldees, an important city of Mesopotamia situated near the Euphrates River. It was a prosperous region, full of commerce, culture, and ancient traditions. But one day God called him to leave all that behind. Genesis 12, verse 1, records that decisive moment. Get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. Abraham obeyed. He was 75 years old when he took that decision. He left his city, his extended family, his security, and his past. He crossed the Euphrates River and began a journey toward Canaan, a land that he did not even know yet from the perspective of those who observed him. Abraham was literally a man who had come from the other side of the river, a foreigner, someone who had traversed a border. For that reason, he began to be known as a Hebrew. He was the man who had crossed, the foreigner who came from beyond the river. But there exists another interesting detail that many scholars mention. Some believe that the term Hebrew could also be related to the name of an ancestor of Abraham called Eber. In Genesis 10, verses 21 to 25, appears the genealogy that connects Abraham with that ancient ancestor. The text explains that Shem begot Arphaxad, Arphaxad begot Salah, Salah begot Eber, and from the descendants of Eber, generations later Abraham would be born. For that reason, some interpret that the term Hebrew can also mean descendant of Eber. Whatever the exact origin may be, the name Hebrew marked a very particular identity. Abraham was not an established king nor a citizen with his own territory. He was a pilgrim. He lived in tents. He moved constantly and did not possess a permanent land. Hebrews 11, verse 9, describes that reality in a very clear way. By faith, he dwelt as a foreigner in the promised land, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents. That was the essence of what it meant to be Hebrew. It was not simply an ethnic label. It was an identity marked by the idea of being a foreigner, pilgrim, someone who did not belong completely to any place of this world. And that identity did not end with Abraham. It continued with his descendants. Isaac, the son of Abraham, was also considered Hebrew. Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, inherited that same identity. And Joseph, the great-grandson of Abraham, was also recognized as Hebrew when he arrived in Egypt. In fact, the Bible records several moments where the Egyptians used that term to refer to him. In Genesis 39, verse 14, the wife of Potiphar talks about Joseph and says, "He has brought in a Hebrew to us to mock us." Later on, in Genesis 41, verse 12, Joseph is identified again as a young Hebrew. When the family of Jacob finally relocated to Egypt, the complete group was formed by barely 70 people. Genesis 46, verse 27, confirms it clearly. All the persons of the house of Jacob who went into Egypt were 70. That small group, however, would not remain small for a long time. With the passing of the years, it began to multiply in an extraordinary way. Exodus 1, verse 7, describes what occurred. The children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly. They were multiplied and grew exceedingly strong. Even so, the Egyptians continued calling them Hebrews. The term kept identifying that foreign people who had arrived from another land. In Exodus 1, verse 15, the midwives of the Hebrews are mentioned specifically. And in Exodus 2, verse 6, when the daughter of Pharaoh finds the baby Moses in the river, she identifies him as one of the children of the Hebrews during approximately 400 years in Egypt. That identity remained. They were Hebrews living as slaves, Hebrews forced to make bricks, Hebrews oppressed under the power of Pharaoh, Hebrews who cried out to God for deliverance. And when finally the moment of that deliverance arrived, God himself used that term to refer to them. When Moses was sent to speak with Pharaoh, the message was very clear. Exodus 3, verse 18 says, "Jehovah, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us," and shortly after. In Exodus 5, verse 3, Moses repeats the same expression, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us." So during all that stage of biblical history, the principal name that identified that people was Hebrews. But something was about to change. After centuries of slavery, the moment of the Exodus arrived. The people left Egypt around the year 1446 before Christ. They crossed the Red Sea and began their way through the wilderness. 3 months later, they arrived at Mount Sinai, and it was there where occurred one of the most transforming moments of all biblical history. In that place, God established a covenant with them, an agreement that would change their identity forever. Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6 records the words of God, "If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." At that point, a new identity begins to form. From that moment on, the people would no longer be known only as Hebrews. They would begin to be known as Israelites. But here arises an important question. If that people began to be called Israelites, from where exactly did that name come? What does Israel really mean? And why did that term come to define an entire nation? To understand it, we need to go back a little in history. Even before the Exodus from Egypt, the origin of the name Israel is found in one of the most mysterious and fascinating episodes of the book of Genesis. The protagonist of that moment is Jacob, the grandson of Abraham. Jacob had lived a complicated life. His own name meant supplanter or deceiver, and in many senses reflected perfectly his history. He had deceived his brother Esau to obtain the birthright, and he had also deceived his father Isaac to receive the blessing. After those events, Jacob had to flee. He spent 20 years living far from his home, working for his uncle Laban. But finally, the moment to return arrived. The problem was that the way back included an inevitable encounter with Esau, the brother whom he had betrayed years ago. Jacob was full of fear. He did not know how Esau would react, nor if he held a grudge. So the night before the encounter, something extraordinary occurred. Genesis 32, verse 24 describes the moment. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. What happens in that passage is deeply mysterious. It is not about a common struggle. The Bible leaves clear that it is a spiritual encounter. Jacob is wrestling with a being who represents the very presence of God. For hours, the struggle continues. Neither of the two gives up. Finally, the text says in verse 25 that the man touched the socket of Jacob's hip and it was out of joint. Even so, Jacob did not let him go. Then something surprising occurs. In verse 26, the man says, "Let me go, for the day breaks." But Jacob responds with determination, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The moment marks a point of transformation in the life of Jacob, and it is then when the visitor pronounces some words that will change history. Genesis 32, verse 28 says, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." That is the birth of the name Israel. The word Israel comes from two Hebrew roots. One of them is Sarah, which can mean to struggle, to persevere, or to contend. The other is El, which is one of the names used to refer to God. For that reason, the name Israel usually is interpreted as the one who struggles with God, the one who perseveres with God, or even God's struggles. The change of name was not just a symbolic detail. It represented a deep transformation in the identity of Jacob. His old name was associated with deception and manipulation. The new name represented a different relationship with God, a renewed identity and a distinct purpose. From that moment on, Jacob would be known as Israel. And that detail is key to understand what occurs later. Israel had 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Each one of them became the ancestor of a tribe. With the passing of time, those 12 families were transformed into the 12 tribes of Israel. For that reason, when the Bible speaks of the children of Israel, it is referring to the descendants of Jacob. And from there is born the term Israelites. Now we can understand better the difference between Hebrews and Israelites. Hebrew was a broader and older term. It was used to describe the descendants of Abraham and was related to the idea of being a foreigner or pilgrim. It was a more cultural and ethnic identity. Israelite, on the other hand, was a more specific term. It meant direct descendant of Jacob, whose new name was Israel, and that identity was linked to the covenant that God established with that people on Mount Sinai. Said in a simple way, all Israelites were Hebrews, but not all Hebrews were Israelites. A clear example of this is found in the family of Esau, the brother of Jacob. Esau was also a descendant of Abraham, so his descendants could be considered Hebrews in a broad sense. However, they were not Israelites because they did not descend from Jacob, who had received the name of Israel. The descendants of Esau became the Edomites. They shared a common origin with Israel, but they did not form part of the nation that God had established through the covenant after the Exodus and of the covenant at Sinai. The term Israelites became the predominant name for that people. It was no longer simply about a family group descendant of Abraham. Now it was a nation organized under the law of God. The book of Numbers reflects clearly this new identity. In Numbers 1, verse 2, God says to Moses, "Take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel during the 40 years that the people walked through the wilderness." That was their principal identity. They were the Israelites, the people of the covenant, the nation that God was forming. When finally they entered into the promised land under the leadership of Joshua, the Bible continues using the same term. Joshua 3, verse 17 says, "All Israel crossed over on dry ground during the period of the Judges." The name continued being the same. Judges 2, verse 11, declares, "The children of Israel did evil in the sight of Jehovah." Later on, when Israel had kings, the 12 tribes formed a single kingdom. Saul was the first king, followed by David and then by Solomon. During that time, the kingdom was united and was known simply as Israel. 2 Samuel 5, verse 5, resumes the reign of David, saying, "In Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah." However, that unity would not last forever. After the death of Solomon, around the year 931 before Christ, occurred a crisis that would change the destiny of the people. His son Rehoboam ascended the throne, but quickly proved to be an arrogant leader. The people asked that he reduce the heavy taxes and the harsh burdens that they had endured during the reign of Solomon. But Rehoboam rejected that petition. 1 Kings 12, verse 14, records his response. "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke." That decision provoked an immediate rebellion. 10 tribes of the north decided to separate from the kingdom. They chose as leader a man called Jeroboam and formed a new independent kingdom. That kingdom maintained the name of Israel and established its capital in Samaria. Meanwhile, only 2 tribes remained faithful to Rehoboam, Judah and Benjamin. They formed the kingdom of the south, known as the Kingdom of Judah, with capital in Jerusalem. From that moment on, the nation was left divided in 2. The kingdom of the north, called Israel, was formed by 10 tribes. The kingdom of the south, called Judah, it was composed principally by 2. This division would mark the beginning of a very complicated stage in the biblical history, and also would prepare the stage for the emergence of a new term that would end up identifying the people of God during the following centuries. That term would be Jews. The division of the kingdom changed completely the course of the history of the people of God. From that moment, there existed 2 separate kingdoms: the kingdom of the north, called Israel, and the kingdom of the south, called Judah. Although both descended from the same ancestors, their ways began to take very distinct directions. The kingdom of the north, Israel, quickly turned away from true worship. Jeroboam, its first king, feared that if the people kept traveling to Jerusalem to worship in the temple, eventually they would return to submit to the kingdom of the south. To avoid it, he took a decision that would have disastrous spiritual consequences. 1 Kings 12, verse 28, describes what he did. He made 2 calves of gold and said to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt." He set up one in Bethel and the other he put in Dan, creating an alternative system of worship. From that moment, the kingdom of the north was trapped in a chain of idolatry. None of its kings was described in the scriptures as a king faithful to God. All continued promoting pagan practices and distancing the people from the covenant. During more than 2 centuries, the prophets warned about the consequences of that way. But the people did not change. Finally, in the year 722 before Christ, the judgment arrived. The Assyrian Empire conquered the kingdom of the north. 2 Kings 17, verse 6 records the moment. The king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away, captive to Assyria. The 10 tribes were deported and scattered through distinct regions of the empire. With time, they lost their collective identity. They no longer returned to establish themselves as a nation. In biblical history and in many later traditions, they began to be known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Meanwhile, the kingdom of the south continued existing. Judah had a more complex history. Some of its kings were faithful to God and tried to reform the nation. Kings like Hezekiah and Josiah promoted the return to the law and the destruction of idols. However, Other kings led the people again toward idolatry. One of the most extreme examples, the king Manasseh, whose spiritual corruption was so deep that the Bible describes him as one of the most wicked rulers in the history of Judah. Throughout those years, God sent numerous prophets to warn the people. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, and others proclaimed messages of repentance. But in general, the nation did not respond completely. Finally, the judgment also reached the kingdom of the south. In the year 605 before Christ, the Babylonian Empire began to invade Judah. The first deportation occurred in that year when young men like Daniel were carried captive to Babylonia. Later, in 597 before Christ, occurred another deportation in which the prophet Ezekiel was carried into exile. But the final blow arrived in the year 586 before Christ. The Babylonian army destroyed Jerusalem. The temple was burned. The walls were broken down, and a great part of the population was carried captive. 2 Kings 25, verse 9, describes the scene. Nebuzaradan burned the house of Jehovah and the king's house. It was a national tragedy. The most sacred place of the people had been destroyed. And it is precisely in that historical context where begins to consolidate the third term Jews. The word Jew comes from Judah, the name of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Judah was the fourth son of Jacob. In Genesis 29, verse 35, is recorded the moment of his birth. His mother Leah said, now I will praise Jehovah." For that reason she called his name Judah. The name Judah is related to the idea of praise. Originally, the term Jew referred simply to someone belonging to the tribe of Judah. But after the exile, the meaning began to broaden. Why did this occur? Because the kingdom of the north already had disappeared centuries before. The 10 tribes had been scattered by Assyria and no longer existed as a recognizable national entity. The only organized group that remained was composed principally by the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. In addition to some Levites, they represented the remnant of the ancient people of Israel. For that reason, the term Jew began to be used to describe all the descendants of the people who remained faithful to the tradition and to the law of Moses. A clear example appears in the book of Esther. Esther 2, verse 5, introduces Mordecai saying, "In Shushan the citadel there was a certain Jew." Later on, in Esther 3, verse 6, is mentioned the decree against the Jews. During the exile in Babylonia occurred something very important for the identity of the people. They had lost their land, their temple, and their system of sacrifices. Then arose a crucial question. How could they maintain their spiritual identity far from Jerusalem? The response was the development of new community practices. They began to meet in places of study and prayer that with time would be known as synagogues. There, they dedicated themselves to read and teach the scriptures. They also emphasized practices that distinguished them clearly from other peoples. Circumcision continued being a sign of the covenant. The Sabbath was kept rigorously. The dietary laws were maintained with great care, and the scriptures were preserved and copied with enormous dedication with time. All those practices formed what today we know as Judaism. It was no longer only an ethnic identity. It was a complete way of life, based on the faith, the law, and the tradition. Decades later occurred an important political change. In the year 539 before Christ, the Persian Empire conquered Babylonia. Its king, Cyrus, permitted that the exiles return to their land. Ezra 1, verse 3, records his decree. "Whoever is among you of all his people, let him go up to Jerusalem." Around 50,000 people returned to Judah in the year 538 before Christ. With time, they rebuilt the temple, which was finished in the year 516 before Christ. Ezra 6, verse 15 confirms the completion of the work. Years later, Ezra led spiritual reforms in 458 before Christ. and Nehemiah rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem in 445 before Christ. During all that period, the paper was known principally as Jews. But even after returning to their land, the nation never became completely independent. First, they were under Persian dominion, then under Greek dominion, and finally under Roman dominion for the era of the New Testament. The term Jew was completely established. It no longer referred only to a tribe, but to all the people who maintained the faith, the law, and the traditions inherited from Israel. The Gospels use this term constantly. John 4, verse 9 mentions that the Jews and the Samaritans have no dealings with each other. Jesus himself was born within that historical identity. He was born in Bethlehem of Judah, was circumcised on the 8th day, and grew within the tradition of the law. His disciples also were Jews. Peter, James, John, and the others shared that same identity. The Apostle Paul also described himself in that way. In Acts 21, verse 39, he says, "I am a Jew, from Tarsus in Cilicia," and in Philippians 3, verse 5, he adds, "circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin." Curiously, Paul uses the three terms at distinct moments. In 2 Corinthians 11, verse 22, he says, "Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I." He understood perfectly the historical differences between those names. Now we can resume everything in a simple form. The term Hebrews appears since the era of Abraham. It identifies the descendants of the patriarch and highlights their condition as pilgrims and foreigners. The term Israelites arises from Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. It describes the nation formed by the 12 tribes under the covenant established in Sinai. And the term Jews consolidates after the Babylonian exile to describe the remnant of the people that preserved the faith, the law, and the scriptures. The three names refer to the same people, but each one belongs to a distinct stage of their history. First, they were Hebrews, a pilgrim family guided by the faith of Abraham. Then they were Israelites, a nation formed by God through the covenant. And finally, they were Jews, the remnant that preserved the faith throughout centuries of dispersion and foreign dominion. Each phase had a purpose within the plan of God. The Hebrews established the lineage of the promise. The Israelites received the law and the prophecies. And the Jews preserved the scriptures while they waited for the Messiah. And it was precisely within that people that Jesus was born. Matthew 1, verse 1, begins saying, "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Jesus was Hebrew by descent, Israelite by heritage, and Jew by birth. But his mission went much beyond those identities. In John 4, verse 22, Jesus said, "Salvation is of the Jews." However, that salvation was not left limited to a single people. Galatians 3, verse 28 declares, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." The history of the Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews does not disappear, but in Christ a way opens that transcends all those divisions. When you understand these differences, your reading of the Bible becomes much richer each time that you find one of those terms. You can recognize the historical moment to which it belongs. Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews are not simply interchangeable words. They are different chapters of a same history. The history of the plan of God that began with Abraham, crossing a river, and that finally reached the entire world.